The governor on a number of occasions has sent memos to go through their individual budgets and identify, do you have an opportunity to save a certain percent? Unfortunately, we've essentially never seen any of those responses. There's an endless appetite for additional spending. The Supreme Court has been very clear in their rulings that benefits only go one way, and that's up. The state has begun relying more and more on revenue from the lottery, sports wagering. The real magic of budget negotiations is understanding where the pressures are in that given year. Legislators have, 40 minutes to look at it before they take a 2 a.m. vote on May 31st.
Joining me today is Tom Demmer, former state rep and former deputy Republican leader. Thanks for coming.
I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, I thought we would just talk about all things state budget. This is a traditionally unsexy topic, but it's kind of gained a lot of momentum and enthusiasm as things have gone nuts the last few years. So why don't you catch us up to speed?
Well, you're right. For a lot of years, people weren't paying very close attention to the state budget, or maybe they'd look for just the one item that they really cared about in the state budget. But the approach that I always took to budget making is it's one of the most important areas of state government because it touches everything. It touches our ability to successfully execute programs. It shows where some of our priorities are. It's a balance between providing services and respecting taxpayers. There's a lot that goes into it. And so it's a very important topic. And as somebody who spent a lot of time on the budget, I'm glad other people are coming along to that as well. But really where we are in the process right now is the governor presents his budget address to the legislature to kind of kick off the budget year each year on the second Wednesday in February. And so the governor will address a joint session of the House and the Senate together and make his formal budget proposal. But interestingly enough, that is like step one of 100. It is just a proposal. It's not the kind of thing that the governor proposes and the legislature says, okay, yeah, we'll take it. Looks good to us. And instead, it kicks off a series of committee meetings, legislative priorities and input, suggestions, alterations, all sorts of things before, in most cases, the budget finally gets introduced as a real bill, usually in the wee hours of the very last day of session. And legislators have, 40 minutes to look at it before they take a 2 a.m. vote on May 31st. So budget season is now till May 31st or the morning of June 1st, maybe.
It is crazy to think about how fast they're reading this budget. It's like 200 pages a minute or something. But tell me, when you're looking at the budget, what are the main factors that go into it? What are the revenue sources? What are the expenditures? What makes up the state budget?
So the full state budget is incredibly complex. It includes allocation of state funds through the most common piece that we talk about, which is the general revenue fund. And that funds most of the normal operations of the state. There's also the state appropriating federal funds, which are monies that come through the state from the federal government. Some of those are for programs that the state has some control over. Others it's merely passed through, and the state doesn't have a lot they can do to it. There's also a whole group of things called other state funds, or OSF, as opposed to general revenue funds, or GRF. So in the other state funds, there are literally hundreds of different state funds that are collected from various kinds of fees or transfers. Sometimes it's a very narrow scope. You pay a fee for a license to be issued to you and you get that back. So some things are very narrow. Other of those funds are pretty large and they can be swept to pay for other purposes. But really there's hundreds and hundreds of different things to keep in mind. So one of the things that I think is important is trying to narrow that a little bit to what are the real important funds that we should be paying close attention to. And that's in the state's general revenue fund budget. There's really the big three sources of revenue there. So it's personal income tax, corporate income tax, and sales taxes. Those comprise the vast majority of the revenues that the state of Illinois brings in. And so just for some reference here, our projections for this upcoming fiscal year from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, personal income taxes, about $28.5 billion. Corporate income taxes, about $4.5 billion. And sales taxes, about $11 billion. So just for some perspective there, and sometimes there's proposals talking about revenue that, is in the tens of millions of dollars. While important, the real areas you want to focus on: personal income tax, corporate income tax, and sales tax.
You have to have people doing things, working and buying things then.
Absolutely. And that's why when you see some changes in the economy, it can hit us in all three of those categories. If you lose a business, you're losing corporate income tax, you're losing employees of that business who pay personal income tax, and you're losing those people going out and spending the money, which generates sales tax. One thing I noticed too is in the last couple of years, the state has begun relying more and more on revenue from the lottery, sports wagering, gambling, casino expansion. Some of those funds are earmarked for specific purposes. But as you look to those sources together, it's billions of dollars at state each year. And it's a growing and a bigger crutch, I think, that the state's relying on in many of these years.
Is that a good practice?
Probably not. It's probably better to confine those towards, a specific purpose, like, paying a bond for something. We know that gambling revenues can fluctuate depending on the economy too. So you want to be a little careful on that. But there's been an expansion of all of those programs. And so the revenue sources have been growing, and it's becoming a more important piece of the state budget than it was 10 years ago.
So as Pritzker gets ready to unveil his 8th now budget address, what's the message that he's going for? What stakes do other lawmakers have in this? And kind of what's the vibe?
So, as we talked about, this kicks off the budget season. So this is really the time when everybody, from the governor to legislators, they're trying to kind of signal their priorities or get the pieces arranged on the chessboard to start playing this budget game over the next couple of months. And people have an incentive to say, I want to put a marker out there early. I want to make sure that everybody else knows this is going to be a priority of mine. And so the governor is playing a little bit of a game of managing some expectations. Ultimately, he's going to be responsible through his agencies for carrying out this budget. So they don't want to come into a year and send the message of, oh, we have plenty of money. Bring us all your new programs you want to spend on.
Your wish list.
They're gonna put a little bit of downward pressure on it, and they're certainly doing that now. They've put out both last fall and then an update this spring from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, some revisions to previous revenue forecasts because of changes at the federal level that they've said is going to reduce, especially in corporate income tax collections in Illinois, reduce what we could expect to bring in. So I think through that and a few other programs, they're kind of signaling to lawmakers, don't come with a big appetite this year. Now, on the other hand, lawmakers, there's quite a few who have a big appetite for spending this year, like many years, and are coming with their own ideas of how we can raise taxes to pay for that additional spending. So this is also the time of year, even if it's not in the governor's budget address, you see a lot of press conferences from industry groups, from advocacy groups, from legislators who are putting out a proposal for additional spending or for additional revenue. Those individual proposals won't move on their own. They're really intended to influence the budget direction over the next couple of months. So
carve out a piece of the pie.
Carve out a piece of the pie. Add additional money into the pot that can be spent. So a lot of times you'll see them come together and say, well, I want to have this. And sometimes they come along with an idea of how they want to pay for it. Other times they don't. So it's an interesting kind of back and forth to see there. But this really is a season for people to signal priorities, try to influence how the budget conversation is going to start, and lay out some markers for things that they really want to see in the end.
I think a term that's thrown around a lot is like a budget gap or budget deficit. This idea that, Illinois is facing, a $5 billion gap or $4 billion or shortfall. Can you explain what that means, how that arises?
So it's basically looking at a projection that extrapolates the future based on past spending. So it's going to say, in the simplest sense, you'd say, let's take all our state spending last year and add 2.5%, 3%, whatever, some inflation adjustment. And then let's compare that to our revenue sources. One of the biggest sources of those projections is the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. So every year they're required to do a 5-year financial forecast for the state. They publish that in October or November, and it shows, the upcoming 5 years, what's that look like. And they're not making any assumptions about policy changes. So they're not forecasting that a program will start or stop, at least not at the state level. they're trying to read, okay, what's the federal changes that are going to influence the budget? And then for everything else, for some things, they know more certain. They know what their debt payments will be. They know what their pension contribution is, or close to what that's going to be. And then for most of the agencies, though, they say, okay, let's look at past practice. What have we done the last couple of years? Assume we're going to do that in the future. And then, compare that to a revenue. Is there enough there, or is there not?
Is that when you're talking about there's GOMBI, the governor's office, and there's COGFA, which is the lawmaker's office. Are these politicized roles at all? Do they have a vested interest in some of these numbers?
It's a good question. So those are the two best sources of information: the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, and then the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability. COGFA is a division of the Legislature. So distinct from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, which tends to be more about pushing the priorities of the governor. But that being said, there's also just some black and white math that each of those organizations are doing. And so when they're reporting numbers, they tend to be pretty accurate. They tend to not vary too much. Sometimes they have slight changes, and that's to be expected anytime you're forecasting. They're talking to economists. They're making guesses about how the national GDP will perform, and you vary 0.1% in one direction or another. You might have a little variation, but for the most part, they're putting out these reports that are you can trust the numbers, but you always want to kind of read into what their assumptions are and kind of understand that a little bit better. So I really like the COGFA reports because they're coming out every month. With updates of what's the last month collection, where do we stand year to date, how does it compare to last year. COGFA or GOMBI doesn't send reports as frequently, but they also have some valuable things like the multi-year projections.
I'm curious if you can weigh in on this at all. Looking at what Illinois has had to go through with, projecting deficits, is that common compared to other states? Are we, just huge spenders, or is this a universal problem?
Well, it's a mixture of things, I think. Our spending pressure has certainly increased every single year. There's been additional programs added, additional benefits added. There's state spending is growing faster than our economy is. So there's a combination of spending growth there, but also in some other states where they're seeing population growth, where they're seeing declining unemployment, where they're seeing, state GDP growth, those kinds of things. Oh gosh, it would be a lot easier if we could see a forecast that said, yeah, we're going to grow by 5% next year, or our population is going to be up 3.5% next year. That would change things radically. So in Illinois, it's really a combination of our spending has been outpacing growth, and our growth has been pretty stagnant.
Because I've seen there have been years where we're like, surprise, there's more money than we expected. And it's gangbusters, excited.
This is always, so during this season, one of the challenges in the budget making is, the GOMBI report for the 5-year forecast comes out in October, November. They're using data that's, a few months old at that point. Then you get to February, the governor has to propose a budget. But you still have a few more months left in this fiscal year, to see collections coming in. And as things are changing in Illinois and around the country and the world, you get new information. And so we've had some of those years where in April, we had one year where there was an additional $1 billion in revenue. We called it the April surprise. And it was because of a bunch of end of year tax activity by people who were doing things in December and then, had to true up when they actually file their taxes in April. It's impossible for us to know all of this, what's happening in the state. So you're always working on forecasts, but it can be challenging when the governor makes a proposal in February. A lot can change by the end of May. A lot can change in the country and the economy. And so you always got to be a little bit, put a little asterisk next to all those projections.
I think that fits into something I'm curious about because you've been part of these budget conversations. And as you pointed out, you have this gap between, what's proposed in February and then the conversations that happen in hearings. And then it all goes behind the doors, behind closed doors, behind the curtains, and a lot of decisions are made. So what is going on in these backdoor budget talks?
That's a great question, and honestly, it varies a lot from year to year, and it's because you're facing different pressures each year. And so while you might be always kind of facing the pressure of overall spending, that top line number, or overall revenue, that top line number, the components that are driving that are different each year, and it's different based on the conditions of the economy. It's different based on utilization of different programs in the state. So sometimes you're getting a higher spending pressure because there were more people who were part of this program, or more applications for this, or vice versa. Some years, like this year, one of the revisions that the governor's office has come back with is that there are a couple of programs in human services that are lower than expected utilization. And so there's some savings to be had there. So you're always kind of keeping an eye on that too. So when you get in those negotiations, there's a political dynamic, of course. There's sometimes a political dynamic even within the parties. How is the House and the Senate working together? How is the governor, fit into this picture? And then what do the two parties look like too? But I think the real magic of budget negotiations is understanding where the pressures are in that given year. So what's the kind of the pain points that we really need to address? And then what levers might be available to pull in any given year. Some people automatically go to, well, we just need a tax increase here. But there's also this opportunity to look at, where is utilization lower? Is there a place where maybe the state's providing a service and we're not eligible for a federal match on this? Or is there a federal program we're not making full use out of? Is there some spending that we call lap spending, so some spending that we're just not going to get through in that year, that we could use. So there's always a lot of those different pressures and levers, and you're trying to manage the whole thing all together amid a sea of 177 legislators, each of whom have a little different vision of what they want to see in the budget and what's their big key priority in the budget. So it's really difficult to manage all of those things together. And I would say it's not done successfully all that often. And, even in years where things might look pretty good, you might come out of there feeling like you're in a worse overall position because maybe we kind of kicked the can down the road on this program a little bit, or we delayed the inevitable in that program a little bit. It can be really difficult to come out and think we got it in the place that we want it to be.
That flagged two things for me. First is how you think Governor Pritzker plays in the talks as compared to if you've seen other times that governors have been, is he super involved or is he more hands back and lets, the lawmaker leaders decide? And then I'm also curious because every lawmaker does come in representing their districts. So how do those, personal projects or personal priorities play a factor?
So on the first question of how involved Governor Pritzker is, he's very involved. He and his staff are very involved in budget negotiations. They're very hands-on in managing the budget, in, like we talked earlier, and about setting the expectations, putting out there, here's what our priorities are, here's where we want to do some programs. So they're very hands-on, with Democrats in both the House and the Senate in control of both of those chambers. There's always a little bit of the jockeying, I think, between is this going to be kind of the House in the driver's seat or the Senate or the governor? There's some of those dynamics at play each year, and it changes a little bit. But the Governor Pritzker and his team are very hands-on in this process. And then we talk about how do individual legislators come in with different priorities? There's kind of a question of scope in some of these, and so sometimes a legislator will come in and they'll have a very, very district-oriented request. Maybe there's a specific organization or institution in their district, and they want to make sure that funding is protected for, that this state agency in this office or this university or, this government program. And so it can be something as basic as, just protect their funding, right? Let's keep them where they were. Or it might be a small line item. Others will come in with, and we're seeing some of this week, with, well, we need to spend, $1 billion more on K-12 education next year. Mm-hmm. Order of magnitude different than somebody else's request. And so you're kind of getting the point on as you get larger with those requests where they're not going to be successful if they're the only one who cares about it. So it really comes down to coalition building. If you have, look in the House, if you have 60 legislators who want something, that's a majority, they're going to get it, right? They could vote that through on their own. So as it closer and closer you get to that point, the more influence you can have. But it always helps in any kind of legislative action. It helps if you can say, I care about this, and I have this list of 15 other people who care about it too. All of us are sort of making our votes contingent on this. That moves the needle. People are always counting votes. That's what the whole game of the legislature is about.
So there's the budget, and then there's the budget implementation bill, and they work together with like the line items of what's in there. But together, they're multi-thousand pages each, right? So I guess my question is, how often are the line items on those pages changing over from maybe beginning of May to the end of May as all these conversations are evolving?
Some of the line items are pretty well fixed, and they're fixed because of, we just sort of say, this in state law, this is how the program is set up. This is, the benefits that are available. This is the eligible population. And then at that point, you're basically just doing some mathematical calculations to figure out what the budget's going to be. And that piece of it, legislators are seldom involved. And that's coming from an agency who's saying, we have 2 million people in this program, right? I mean, they're just doing the math. So those numbers, they might change slightly, but those are relatively fixed. The most back and forth usually happens with some kind of lump sum increases to things. They say, I want to add an additional $50 million to violence prevention grants or, something like that. And you might see, okay, in this draft of the bill, there is a line item for that. In this one, there's not. So it might be just kind of coming in and out totally. Wow. There might be some where it's, okay, here we'll give you 25. Nope. Then it moves up to 50. So there is quite a bit of change on that happening kind of behind the scenes. Whether or not it's in actual bill form and introduced like that, you are a lot of times playing these things off against each other. And sometimes it's with the same person. They might say, I want to see $50 million for this and $50 million for that. And at the end of the day, you might have to say, well, it's one or the other, right? We can't do both. And so there's a lot of horse trading,
That's like all you know.
Yes, that's right. That's great.
Get cozy with your lawmaker. Okay, so I remember in Governor Pritzker's first budget address, I think it was 2018, he started teasing this idea for the progressive income tax. And he was painting a picture of a choice that Illinois has to make. We either need more revenue and we're going to find it in this source, or we're going to have to make cuts. What's funny is, we didn't pass the progressive income tax, and that choice keeps coming up, although our budget has also gone up billions of dollars. So how real is this, question that is proposed where we either have to cut services or we need to increase spending? What are the themes and messages that they're trying to tease and make out?
Oh, they certainly, I remember in that 2020 ballot initiative, there were some pretty draconian threats that were made about how decimated Illinois services would be if the graduated tax and, $4.5 billion tax increase didn't pass. Of course, voters rejected that. And the state, as you mentioned, the state budget continues to grow aggressively. It continues to grow aggressively. That's partially because legislators went and found a whole bunch of other taxes that they were going to increase instead of the graduated tax. But I think there always is going to be this, pass our tax or else kind of messaging. And we're seeing the graduated tax, the progressive tax initiative come back now. And, right. It's never truly dead, I guess. But, the governor has signaled support for it. Many legislators have signaled support for it. And I think it's interesting, in order to implement a progressive tax, you have to get voter approval, right? You have to amend the Constitution in order to do that. And so luckily for Illinois taxpayers, it can be one of those things that on the very last day of session, they just sneak into a bill in order to pay for all their additional spending. But they could, in this legislative session, they could pass an initiative, a resolution to put that question back on the ballot in one form or another. And I think we're going to have to pay pretty close attention to what that looks like, because there are a number of Democratic legislators who think we don't have near enough money to spend on all the things we want to spend on. And the only place we can go for it is to come back to taxpayers and ask them for more.
When they say we don't have enough to spend, what does more spending mean? Like, what does more government spending equate to?
I mean, it would certainly equate in many of the core areas of state spending to just additional dollars outlaid by the state. So one of our largest areas of spending is K-12 education. There's a proposal, some lawmakers are talking $1 billion a year extra right now. There are some who are saying we're $5 billion a year short in K-12 education. And so, even for something that, a lot of people want to have good quality education, there's this wild discrepancy in how much it's going to cost to do that. Some people would say, I'll throw an additional $5 billion at it. Others who would say, we're going to use that additional spending to do more programs, to create new programs, to provide new services, to add additional benefits, to give people more in Medicaid, or give people more in SNAP or food assistance programs, or give out new grants to community organizations doing any number of things across the state. There's an endless appetite for additional spending, and what it means for each legislator might look a little different, but trust me, there's no shortage of new ideas.
One thing we saw in Chicago this year was aldermen flat out rejected Brandon Johnson's wealth tax. They kind of drew a line in the sand saying, we have to protect business interests. And it was interesting to see that in Chicago, because it feels like they've learned a lesson that Springfield lawmakers are still grappling with, where the default in Springfield seems to be going to taxing businesses. How do Springfield lawmakers start to learn that lesson?
I think it's a question of sort of how bad does it need to get before they wake up to the impact of this. We talk a lot about how does Illinois compare to other states, because it's a very valid question of, if somebody's going to make a new investment, some private business is going to come and build a new factory in Illinois, or build a new office in Illinois, and they're going to hire hundreds or thousands of people, and they're going to make a capital investment that's a generational commitment to being in a state. They're going to think long and hard about, what's the tax policy look like here? What does the liability policy look like here? What's the workforce look like here? What's housing availability? All these kind of things are going into that area. But taxes are pretty easy to compare, because you can just look at a rate here and a rate here. You can have your accountants make a comparison of, what would it cost me every year to have this location in Texas? What would it cost me to have it in Illinois? I think aldermen in Chicago are acutely aware of that, because Chicago is one of the top tier of cities where you're not competing against every little town across the country. You're really kind of in this tier where you say, all right, I have maybe 4 or 5 options of where I could go to make a signature investment like this. Chicago's on that list in a lot of cases. But we've seen people leave the city of Chicago, relocate headquarters to other locations. People haven't grown their facilities here. And so I think aldermen have started to say, well, look, we really need to address the fact that when it comes to stacking Chicago up against other cities, we're not coming out on the winning end of these things. The same is true of Illinois. There's a different competitive landscape as you broaden, from the city to the entire state. But lawmakers in Springfield really have to think around, if somebody is making a decision about whether to locate anywhere in Illinois, a small town, mid-sized town, the suburbs, the city, whatever it could be, they're stacking that up against someplace else. And so hopefully at some point they say, it's not a good look for us to have the highest property taxes in America. This is causing us to lose opportunities. It's not a good look to have the 3rd highest corporate income taxes in America. It's not a good look for us to every single year make all these arcane tax policy changes that take hundreds of millions of dollars more from businesses that are, stuck here in some way. They have to wake up to that competitive dynamic. And that's going to be when they say, look, enough is enough. We can't jeopardize going any further in this, because we can't jeopardize losing another major employer or missing out on another major investment.
It's almost like these companies are looking at their own budget and balance sheet, and taxes expense that they have to pay. So if you can make a decision to lower expense, that could increase your revenue.
It absolutely could. And, it's not the only thing they're looking at. There's a lot of dynamics that go into place for these. But again, it's very easy to quantify what that's going to be. And so if maybe you're on the fence and you're sort of stuck between two locations, if you're going to pay, half price someplace else, that looks like a pretty good deal.
And businesses are important because, as you pointed out, they're one of the major contributors to the revenue that the state uses.
Directly through corporate income tax, but more importantly, through all of their employees, all of those people who are bringing home a salary, who are paying a tax, who are buying food at the grocery store, who are investing in a house, all of those kind of things that contribute to a dynamic economy. It's very interconnected with what's your job market look like, and the job market relies on corporate decision makers.
I always think it's funny when I hear people talk about the budget is how different it seems like it functions than like when I'm trying to budget or when corporations are trying to budget, where you're looking at, okay, here's what I know my income is, and then this is how much I have to spend on something. So if I wanted to spend more, I'd have to go get a raise. But the government can just hike taxes and get themselves a raise. So is this a feature or a bug?
A bug. It's a bug. But one of the pressures that comes to any kind of government budget, but especially at the state level, is there's a difference between creating a program in state law. So passing a bill that says we're going to create a new agency to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to give this amount of money to all these people. And then on the other hand, though, that you have to have an appropriation to actually spend that money. So there can be a disconnect between what the state has created programs to do, put the rules in place on, establish the criteria for, and establish what the benefit is. Then you have to come back in order for that program to operate and for the state not to go into debt. You have to come back and find an appropriation, so actual money within the budget to be able to spend in that year. That can be a real pressure. And the reason is because the program that you may have created 5 years ago, each year you have to come back and give new appropriation to it. So the eligibility and the kind of the construct of a program exists in law for a long period of time, but every single year it comes back to be one of those pressures influencing the budget. Or if you don't appropriate enough money for something in a year, the state might end up with, back in the world of unpaid bills, where we've incurred these liabilities for a program, but we don't have the appropriation authority to pay it today. So we have to just hold the bill and wait until we get appropriation authority to pay it later.
It really is so technical. And I think that's why people just kind of gloss over it. But it does make a difference, I think. Care about getting good value for government services. We want the state to do well. So the budget matters. The Illinois Policy Institute for the last many years has proposed plans for how to do a balanced budget without tax hikes. What fiscal reform could look like. Could you tell me a little bit about what a plan from Institute entails?
Yeah, I mean, some of those things that you want to just get on the right trajectory with is we know that Illinois has been facing some of these spending pressures, these fiscal pressures for years and years and years. You're not going to flip a switch and be out of those problems tomorrow. But you have to make a decision at some point to say, we're going to stop these irresponsible practices from the past and try to take a new direction. So a few of the things that we're proposing are things like instituting a spending cap based on what we've actually seen the growth of the economy looks like over the past several years. So no more just kind of a year to year, we're going to inflate an estimate here and we're going to spend additional money. We would be limited by what the actual growth of the economy had been in Illinois, not by squeezing more taxpayer money out of them, by saying, how is the economy doing? Let's try to keep these two in line with each other. That would frame for legislators at the beginning of a budget year, this is the most amount of money that we can spend this year. Now we're going to live within that means. Instead of like what we talked about before, people are coming into the table with, raise this tax and then we'll spend it here, and then raise this tax and we'll spend it here. And that has happened year after year after year and contributed to this. A couple of other reforms that I think are really important are the reforms that change some of the budget process. So the process right now, as we talked about, you can pass a bill that has financial liabilities to it without passing an appropriation that accompanies it. There are other states where they tie the two of those together. They say you can't have a bill that spends new money unless you have that money identified in the budget already. So they pair those things up together. That's, I think, a good practice. And then we also talk about some of on the taxation proposals, a lot better transparency in what those taxation proposals are and how it impacts Illinois families. So a requirement to, instead of having a bill at 2 a.m. on the last day of session that includes all these arcane tax increases, we'd say if you're going to do any tax increase, you have to have a public hearing on it. You have to have the chance for people to weigh in, and you're required to take into account and give a projection for how this impacts not just the state budget, but also the economy in Illinois businesses and Illinois families. What's the burden going to be on them, and how is it going to, how does that weigh off against the public spending proposal that you have? So those are your kind of things that it's transparency. It's even if, we don't have control of the legislature, even if the legislature wants to raise taxes, if they did it in a more transparent way, they were honest about what the impacts were, people could actually follow, then voters would be empowered to say, do I think this is a good deal or not a good deal? Instead of saying, I had no idea they passed this thing. I have no idea where this money is coming from. Even legislators who can't explain what this tax increase was and how much money it's going to go and whether or not it's a good idea to do it.
It sounds very common sense, but is this something that takes place in other places?
It does. And, we've tried to look at some other states for sound budgeting practices. And there's a lot out there. Part of the wonder of the United States is having these laboratories of democracy at the state level. Everybody does it a little differently. Some states do 2-year budgets, some do 1 year. Some have outside setups between the legislature and the executive for how the spending actually flows through. I'd love to try a number of different proposals there. But, it's also difficult to sort of blow up the entire system in Illinois and say, let's, we amend the Constitution and rewrite all this. We're just trying to look for some things that are going to be a step in the right direction. This would be an upgrade for the Illinois budget process, not, a middle of the night downgrade.
It's a theme that I hear because even in the city of Chicago, something like a city charter would make city older people and members of the city council have to ask taxpayers for input before doing something like that. And I think maybe Colorado has something like a taxpayer bill of rights where you just have more stakeholders involved instead of like a back room at 2 a.m. to your point.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, in order for the state to function, there have to be taxes. So the question is always, what are those taxes? Like, which ones do you need? At what levels do you need them? How do you try to get the necessary revenue for essential programs without making Illinois a huge outlier in one way or another, put us at a big disadvantage here? You don't want to go all in on one tax and ignore a whole bunch of others. So you want things to be balanced, transparent, understandable. You want people to be able to see, okay, when I pay this tax, I know it's going to this program, and the state and local level, they know who to call if they're not happy with, how things are going. So I think all of those things are interconnected, but it's really about building some kind of trust with voters, building trust with businesses who are looking to locate in the state of Illinois, and then, building some predictability and sustainability for those essential government services that the state operates.
Yeah, shout out to property tax bills because you can really see the line items and it is shocking.
Yes.
Right?
You know who to call, right? You see, is it the school? Is it the park district? Whoever it could be.
Yeah, the library. Right. It's laid out there in pensions versus regular spending, which is an aspect, I think, of the Illinois budget as well, right? You can't have this budgeting conversation without one of the largest single line items.
Yes, that's right. So pensions, take over $11 billion a year out of the state's general revenue fund to make that pension contribution. And, part of that is the annual costs for employees who are working, but a lot of that is legacy cost of trying to get to buy down our unfunded liability that's been accruing for years and years of underpayment in the state's pension system. Interestingly, the governor has a new proposal out for changing what the funding target is for the pension system, identifying a couple of additional revenue sources that could be dedicated towards more aggressively paying down the state's pension obligations, and then some technical changes in how the Social Security wage base is calculated and how we smooth out, some of our contributions over time. So there's a lot of technical aspects to pensions, but I think it's an important conversation to have, to say we should be more aggressively paying down pensions because over the long term, that saves hundreds of billions of dollars for taxpayers. And we should be looking for, instead of just saying, we've identified this revenue piece over here, let's go spend it on ongoing operational costs. We should be using those kind of revenue sources to pay down our long-term liabilities before we just say, dollar in, dollar out every year.
What's the risk of this proposal?
Well, there's a few things. I think there's an open question about how, so he wants to change the target from reaching 90% funded in 2045 to 100% funded in 2048. If you stretch out for those additional 3 years, you don't want that changed ramp to lower your contributions in the early years, because that just means you're basically borrowing money from the future against those. But if you keep on the target that we're at, and you go beyond 2045, you get to 100%. That's a good thing. We should get up to 100%, pay down that liability. It's kind of in the math of how you get there, and how you could even get there faster with this proposal by using some of the additional revenue sources, like the income tax refund fund. He said we should use that surplus to put towards pensions, or we have some pension bond debt that will be retiring in a few years. He said we should take what we're currently using for debt service and put that into the pension system. Those are good ideas to do. And that could help us pay down our liability even faster than projected.
Shifting to another aspect of the budget, I think what happened with DOGE brings a lot of, people said, could there be, too much spending in the federal government? Whether that's true or not, it makes you wonder about the state government. And we've talked a lot about the revenue side and more spending. But I guess the question is, can you stop spending in certain areas? Are there things to cut,
We absolutely need to have the kind of top to bottom review to ask that question. As I mentioned, sometimes these budgets tend to get built by saying, well, what did we spend last year? And let's add, grow it by whatever going into the future. Of course, you're going to have some inflation and things like that, but you shouldn't ignore the base, because the base is the bulk of what we're spending here. One of the disappointing things from the Pritzker administration so far has been the governor on a number of occasions has sent memos or given direction to his agency directors to go through their individual budgets and identify. In different years, he's asked for different percentages, but basically identify, do you have an opportunity to save a certain percent out of your budgets? And that's what we should be charging agency directors with. Make sure you really know where your operations are. But unfortunately, we've essentially never seen any of those responses. So the governor is, always kept those very close to the vest instead of implementing them like we could have been doing over the last few years. In fact, this year, for the first time, he issued an executive order last fall and said, identify spending reductions for me. When the proposal came out early this year, there was only a tiny, in the tens of millions of dollars out of a $50 billion budget that were actual spending reductions. The bulk of those claimed reductions were what we actually talked about earlier, which was funding that wasn't being spent because caseload was lower than what it was projected to be, or a transfer that we didn't have to make because federal revenue was coming in and it was alleviating the need for that transfer. So those are the kind of things that's a little bit of a budget gimmick. That would have happened with or without the executive order, right? There was just fewer people coming in the door at a certain place. It would have happened with or without it. And so the disappointing part has been throughout all these requests for agency efficiencies, we kind of came up with, $30 million or something in actual. Yes. I mean, that's $30 million that we shouldn't be spending, but it doesn't do a lot to close a gap in a $50 billion budget.
Minnesota gained a lot of headlines recently for this fraud, saying that they were funding childcare, among other things that turned out to be false. And granted, that was a different state, different situation, but to what extent are there issues here in Illinois with that?
I mean, there's going to be fraud in almost every state's budget. The question is, are you aggressive about trying to root it out? are you looking for? Are you using new technologies to assist you in going through hundreds of thousands of lines on a spreadsheet? Or, are you doing that kind of that data analysis that can help you identify where there's outliers, where there's suspicious payments? We know in Illinois, we saw a lot of this when there was the reviews of PPP loans, and they could find that 17 of them all went to the same address, and well, there's a red flag that you should be looking for. So Illinois programs, especially those that have hundreds of thousands or millions of recipients, those are the kind of programs where you really need to be very diligent about verifying eligibility for people, about making sure that you're only providing the covered services or you're providing things within the parameters that are set. One of the areas we're seeing right now, there could be a problem in Illinois, is in our SNAP program, so the food assistance program. We have a higher error rate than a lot of other states do. And some of it is just administrative error. It's, understandable. I mean, every business on earth has those kind of administrative or red tape types of things. But if our error rate is notably higher than what other states are, we should ask ourselves why. We should try to get to the bottom of that. That's something that, not only is about running a good, efficient program, but it's also, because of recent federal changes, a way for Illinois to avoid costly penalties to the program, where if our error rate maintains higher than a lot of other states are, we're going to be penalized extra for that. So we have kind of a dual incentive to get more serious about trying to verify that the programs we're running are run with integrity.
That's a good point, because I think when people hear about, STAP, you think families, they need assistance, why not just default to making sure if there's a question that they get it, but the state is losing money that it could actually be spending on people in need.
Absolutely. I mean, every dollar that you're, paying to a fraudulent purpose in these programs is a dollar that's coming away from somebody else. And so, the people who are really in need of these kind of programs, we need to provide that to them in a good, reliable program. We can't, let our compassion get in the way of somebody's going to come in and exploit those vulnerabilities. And as we've seen countless times, each time there's an audit on these things, they say, oh, this guy had it figured out, and, he's got some server farm and, overseas, and they're filling out applications for whatever. Those are the kind of things that people take advantage of. If there's free money, there's going to be somebody who steps up and obtains that, whether through fraud or not.
So we've talked about so many aspects of the budget. Is there anything else that you really want to hit that you think would help people understand the decisions that the state is making?
I just think the important part for people out there who are concerned about the growth in state spending, and certainly concerned about the tax burden that we have in place in Illinois. We've seen the reports about, and taxes, both at the local level and the state level, things where, we're paying some of the highest combined tax rates of anybody in America, some of the highest corporate tax rates, made it hard for job growth to continue. If you're concerned about those things, you need to call your legislators, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, because people who want to spend money on a new program, they have a real incentive to make those phone calls, to show up in Springfield, to advocate for the thing that they care about, for a new program or a new spending increase. Sometimes, people who are concerned on the tax side of it just sort of sit back and shake their head and feel like there's nothing they can do about it. I think it's important that people who are concerned about tax burden, they make their voice heard, just like people who are coming out there with all these new ideas for spending. It matters to contact your legislator. It matters that they know that they're not just doing all these things and sort of everybody's going about their lives as normal. These do have impacts, and lawmakers need to hear from constituents about what those are.
Well, and if anyone is listening and wants to contact their lawmakers, shout out to IllinoisPolicy.org, where you can press contact your lawmaker. We do have a lookup tool. We could drop that in the show notes, but I think that's a great point. How are you feeling about watching the budget making process now that you're, have retired from that aspect of lawmaking? You're watching it from behind the scenes.
I still follow it pretty closely, and, have a talk with some of my colleagues, my former colleagues in Springfield, and kind of understanding what to look for, what's sort of being signaled by this, or what's the real story behind that. I would say coming into this year, there's a lot of uncertainty around who's going to win the messaging battle, or who's going to win that chess match between some of the Democratic legislators who have proposed pretty significant spending increases and accompanying tax increases, versus those who are saying, we need to be cautious about this. Federal revenues might be changing. We have these other pressures in place. There's a little bit of a power struggle within the Democratic Party today among those competing camps, and whoever's successful in that story is going to be what's going to drive the budget outcome this year. And I'm not sure I have a good sense for who's in the driver's seat right now. I think there's a genuine struggle.
Speaking about the pension debate that's going on right now, there are major consequences for those. So what is at stake with what is being proposed?
We know one of the important things to keep in mind about pension benefit increases is that as soon as the pension benefit is increased, it becomes a constitutionally protected right for individuals who have a pension in Illinois. So it's not the kind of thing where you can say, in a good year, we'll increase pension benefits, but then if the economy turns against us and we can't afford them anymore, we'll take those back. That's not the way it works. The Supreme Court has been very clear in their rulings that, essentially in Illinois, benefits only go one way, and that's up. So you should be very careful in any given year where you could say, well, if we just make this small tweak to a formula and increase the pension benefits, it's only going to cost us X million dollars this year. The reality is that becomes a pension benefit forever. And so it's the recurring cost, it's the unfunded liability impact that it's going to have. It changes that whole math as you go forward and project. So we need to be sure that you distinguish pension benefit increases from other kinds of spending increases that can be increased and decreased as time goes on.
If I were a new lawmaker, I think I would be overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of information that goes into these decisions. And, no one wants to make Illinois' vulnerable population suffer. So it just seems very complex.
It is really complex, and it takes quite a while. And, I spent 10 years there, and I still don't know everything about what's going on. It really takes a lot of practice. And as I said before, each year the pressures are a little bit different. So you might have learned a lesson last year, and then this year it's, sort of not a big deal, and you've got something else that you need to deal with. So it's really about trying to approach it with a good framework, with a good goal in mind, and then respond to some of the changing tides as they come in.
Your best forecast for what you think the hot debate will be this year?
I think there'll be a lot of debate around education funding. I also think there'll be a lot of debate around pension benefits. And those two, there's some overlap there, given that, teachers, not only is there funding for K-12 education operations for schools, there's also the pension piece of that. And so there's been a lot of push by education groups to increase operations spending and to add additional pension benefits in place. I think those are going to be two pretty hot topics this year that have huge budget impacts because of the dollar amounts we're talking about.
I guess we'll see what all goes down. But thank you so much, Tom, for coming.
Absolutely. Great conversation. Thanks.